Welcome to the fifth in a series of online interviews with Richard Harvey, psychospiritual psychotherapist and spiritual teacher. My name is Rob Meager. I'm an interfaith minister, and I lead a spiritual ministry initiative in Ottawa, Canada called Spiritual Guidance. And I've been a student of Richard Harvey's work since 2012. Today's interview will discuss the lecture Honoring the Gate, Blessing, Gratitude, and the Golden Opportunity, Part 2 of 2, from the Sashti Poorthi Lecture Seminars. This is the fourth lecture in an 8-part lecture series, and each subsequent interview in this interview series will explore in more detail each one of the lectures in the Sashti Poorthi Lecture Seminars. Today's interview about the lecture Honoring the Gate and all of the Sashti Poorthi Lecture Seminar manuscripts are contained in an ebook entitled Dharma Sky, which is available through the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/books. Dharma Sky is one of a trilogy of 3 ebooks, each containing 14 lectures, totaling 42 lectures. The second ebook is entitled Moksha Dawn, and the third ebook is entitled Bodhi Ocean and is currently in production. Again, all ebooks are available through the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/books. You can also listen to the full recording of each of the lectures in the series online through the Sacred Attention Therapy website at www.sacredattentiontherapy.com/education. And now I would like to provide you with some background about Richard Harvey. He is a psychospiritual psychotherapist, author, and spiritual teacher. His career spans 37 years, working with individuals, couples, groups, and communities. He trained in humanistic and transpersonal psychologies and psychotherapy, studied meditation in India, and trained in Soto Zen. He has been influenced by Jung, Gurdjieff, Alan Watts, and Joseph Campbell, the ancient Taoists and the Vedas, predominantly Advaita Vedanta. He has a particular affinity with Ramakrishna, Vivekananda, and Ramana Maharshi, and was more recently inspired by Adidas Samaraj and Nisargadatta. Deeper than all these varied experiences and teachings, however, is the early sense of truth Richard possessed since childhood, a deep understanding and intimacy with the noumena, the divine source of being. It is from this innate wisdom that his spiritual teaching has blossomed, grown, and developed. Richard is a prolific and passionate author. 2 of his books were self-published efforts, The Book of Being in 1998 and Tao's Gift in 2005. The Flight of Consciousness was published by Ash Grove Publishing in 2002, and his latest book, Your Essential Self, The Inner Journey to Authenticity and Spiritual Enlightenment, was published by Llewellyn Worldwide Limited in 2013. Richard has published nearly 200 articles, and he is currently working on his forthcoming book entitled Your Sacred Calling. Richard's lifetime of study, work, and experience has culminated in his independent psychospiritual psychotherapy practice from his mountaintop spiritual center, Cortillo Llano de Montarno. The center is set in a beautiful and tranquil 3 acres on the beautiful southern slopes of the Sierra Nevada mountains in Andalusia, Spain. From his center, Richard offers individual therapy and couples counseling in person or via Skype to people all over the world, psychospiritual training and supervision, courses, and retreats. Richard Harvey's work connects personality and spirituality through a middle stage of heart awakening, authenticity, and compassion in his comprehensive model of human development, the 3 stages of awakening. He is the founder of sacred attention therapy, a profound, radical, and fresh approach to sacred spiritual life and to the dilemmas which have arisen from the accelerated development of ego processes in the 21st century. He believes that it is through the transformation of the individual in his unique struggle to become fully him or herself that we will progress through a collective gestation of soul and spirit into a timely light and expanded consciousness. And now it's my pleasure to welcome and invite Richard Harvey to the call.
Hello, Robert.
Hello, welcome. It's good to see you.
You too.
We're here today talking about part 2 of Honoring the Gate. And just as a quick reminder, the gate in the 2-part lecture refers to those opportunities in life, those blessings in life that give us the opportunity to move beyond the character, move beyond the ego. Have I summarized that?
Good.
Accurately?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And so early on in part 2, you talk about teachers and students in this process. And I'm going to quote a little bit from the very beginning of the lecture. At this border, the border being the gate, at this border the personality dissolves. The character evaporates and the essence, the core of truth inside the human being emerges. And you go on to talk about how in that process there are teachers and there are students. And you go on to say that, but even if you have experienced enlightened insights and spiritual events, this does not necessarily make you a teacher. Teaching is not an inevitable outcome of spiritual experience. Teaching is a functional gift, a blessing of life that you are given or not. And what I wanted to ask, because in many faith traditions it emphasizes that we're both teachers and students, and whoever comes into our life is a teacher. And would you agree that everyone is both teacher and student? I understand what you're sharing in the lecture, but would you also agree that everyone's our teacher in life?
Potentially, of course, anything can teach, not even necessarily a person, enlightened or otherwise. It's really an impersonal affair, quite regardless of whether it's a person or another kind of an event. And the functional gift emphasizes the nature of its impersonality. What I'm really talking about in the quote is that one may formally embrace the function of teacher because that blessing or gift has been granted. So one is innately, shall we say, through one's capacity and potential, destined to fulfill that in one's life. And I think we should bear in mind that traditionally over thousands of years it's been made clear, while many spiritually enlightened beings have come forth in the role of teacher, many have also remarked that as many, if not more, have retired from any kind of public life, and possibly even become hermits, and are not involved in any way in conveying the teaching. I mean, an outstanding example, just to recall and remember, is initially the Buddha was reluctant to teach at all, maintaining that the true teaching was in silence and would only be compromised in concepts. So if you look at it that way, any of us who actually are willing to talk about it, because the function of teaching means that we're involved in the, excuse the idea, but the futility of spiritual teaching by enunciating it. Then that idea of withdrawing, and after all having effect, shall we say etherically or astrally, on an energetic level, undoubtedly having effect for the collective, may well be the most integrated, the deeper teaching in a way. It may be that those of us who talk about it are simply the compromising ones.
Well, I want to use that as an invitation to pick up on another point shortly after where we just discussed in the lecture. And very shortly after that, again, I'm going to read just a couple of paragraphs. You say, today, much of what passes for spiritual teaching is a pale version of the truth. The truth, in any case, is itself a ripple on the ocean as it appears in this, the relative world in which humanity struggles for enlightenment. The popular spiritual teachers of today are not malevolent or intentionally misleading, but many are unconscious, and the seductions of power and other material and physical rewards are enormous. You go on to say, spirituality is less a matter of knowledge, more a matter of wisdom, and knowledge is not wisdom. What this means is that the popular spiritual guides and teachers who have either intentionally or intuitively picked up minor methods of hypnotism, both collective and individual, cannot by any means be assumed to possess any wisdom whatsoever. Wisdom may be possessed by the illiterate, Ramakrishna and Nisargadatta, to name but two. This is not the first time in your lectures you've offered, might I use the word cautionary notes when it comes to spiritual teachers. And what I wanted to ask is, can the popular spiritual guides and teachers, and I'm going to hold back from naming any, there's many of them, one only has to go to any number of spiritual websites and bless their hearts, they're doing what they feel they need to do. But can these spiritual guides and teachers also be serving an important purpose for humanity at this time?
Well, what purpose? You mean a valid spiritual purpose, perhaps?
Yeah.
It's an interesting idea. It's not a new idea. I mean, the idea that the guru figures who arose in the late 70s, throughout the 80s and early 90s, who themselves were disenfranchised of their followings due to their activities that were in some ways scandalous, were somehow referring disciples back to themselves. In other words, this age-old idea, well, not age-old, but at least an old idea that one is one's own guru, and that therefore the disillusionment with them was in and of itself a teaching. It's not a new idea, I mean, maybe not, I don't know. All I know is that it's confused, it's superficial, it's not authentic very often, it's very thin soup, and therefore it is what it is. My objection is not to the material in itself, whether the sentimental presentation, the literature, the courses, the talks and so on. My objection to it is pretty much the same as when I was a kid and I would listen to blues music, and then people would sing blues songs, and people would say, that's really good blues. I mean, Pat Boone singing blues just wasn't blues, It was so it was so anesthetized and cleaned up. It just wasn't dirty enough to be blues. And I would take my records out and say, look, you've got to listen to Leadbelly and you've got to listen to Lightning Hopkins. You know, I mean, Pat Boone doing Leadbelly just didn't have the spirit. And so this is an analogy. I'm sure there's analogies in art as well as music and poetry and so on and so on. It's the same feeling I have today. I live in a wonderful, beautiful place of incredible light. And there's many watercolor specialists around here who I'm sure it's not that hard to find a beautiful picture and they paint it and then they exhibit it. But it's not beautiful once they've put it down onto the canvas. They don't have the gift. It's not the real thing. And then you'll go and see an artist, and that's another matter. He's seen a way to show you a bridge between the inner and outer worlds, and there's a piece of art. I'm very interested in this difference because I feel if art fades, along with the sacred, and art is a part of the sacred rituals and ceremonies of humanity, then we're in very real trouble collectively, societally and globally. I'm very interested in this. Therefore, to answer the question directly in conclusion, even if the populist spiritual writers, teachers, etc., have some function, I'm still going to object to spirituality being presented in the forms which they do, because it simply isn't art. It simply is not the real.
You get to the heart of the matter in the lecture when you share, I've thought long and hard about this problem of criticism of the modern-day watered-down materialistic version of the personal and transcendent liberation of human beings. I have concluded that these teachers are confusing spirit with soul. And I wanted to ask, how did you come to the conclusion that these popular spiritual guides and teachers are confusing spirit with soul?
Well, I had considered these big words, these big important words. They're 3 S words, really. Self, the capital S one, soul and spirit. And I had considered the difference between these when I became serious about writing, because I think if you're going to be serious about writing, or this compromise of presenting the wordless teaching in words, you know, that ridiculous compromise, at least know what you're saying. And what that means is, rather than casting words like God and consciousness and soul and spirit around, what precisely do I mean by this? What is it conveying, and how may it be different to other people, other people's meanings of it? And in early translations of the Upanishads and the Bhagavad Gita and other holy scriptures, you get a lot of mingling of self with a capital S and soul and spirit in a way that seems almost designed to confuse. And it was really the motivation out of this that led to Flight of Consciousness. It's my humble attempt to unconfuse us about terminology and different religious approaches and say, look, here's a model of movement into the spiritual that embraces all of them and tries to do away with the confusion. The soul, I consider the connection that we have with the relative plane. And it's born, there's 2 important references to this conclusion. I think one is there are many wonderful, kind, compassionate, authentic, beautiful souls in the world who are atheistic. I mean, there's no question about that. And some of them are much more kinder and compassionate and authentic than people who are religious or spiritual. So, you know, you've got to notice that. And you say, well, what's going on? And when you talk to them about elevated experience, or you talk to them about what we might think of as transcendence, they tend to say it's somehow within the auspices of human relationship. You know, it's an elevated but nonetheless human, and never numanistic or theistic experience. And that's their belief system meeting their human experience, you see. What have they got that would bring them to that conclusion? And the answer is the soul connects to nature, to other people, to relationship, to poetry, to beauty, and all of this through the senses. So they see, touch, feel, smell, taste in an elevated way, and then they say, you know, the love that I have for my dog, my child, my friend, my spouse, and all of this, this is a wonderful, elevated, and as high as it goes, experience. Now, we share the soul, because the soul is the looking downwards. It is the soul is the very first tendencies towards the noumena when we asked what happens to people when they die, and we put them in the ground and things grew out of the ground. So we're going way back here to primitive people when there is this thought of the mystery, but it's very downward tending. 3,000 years ago, 3,500 years, and we begun to live in cities, we looked up. And so was born the spirit, in the sense of what is the patterning from above, from the intellectual rational spheres on which we'll base cities and urbanization and the coming together and all of this. And then we had a whole different perspective, a whole different view. We were looking up, and this sent us towards the Sahasrara, the seventh chakra, the spiritual chakra, through the sixth, and the center of spiritual vision, you see. So soul you will find in all sorts of people who are not spiritual. It's our deep connection to nature, to the earth. Spirituality and spirit you will find in those of us who look further in the sense of up, and also, of course, out of this world, to find God in whatever form we may manifest God, but actually in the formless form in which God actually exists.
Now, in that description you just shared, and I want to say, from the first time I heard it, I appreciated your distinction between the soul and the spirit. But in that description, is the soul then analogous to the ego? Because you shared that the soul through experience, through the senses, and the ego is about having an experience, and it experiences this realm through the senses, through our sight, through our touch, through our taste, through our hearing. Is the soul then, in your description, analogous to the ego?
No, you can have soul without ego, but you can't have ego without soul. Ego is of the mind. Ego is the mind. The mind's workings are the ego processes. There's no distinction. If you can transcend mind, there's no ego anymore. It's like unplugging the television.
Okay.
There's no program. The ego is a program, ego is a delusion, ego is a belief in separation, and ego is engendering division. It comes from mind, and you can, I mean, anybody can do the basic exercise to experience the truth of that. If you go into your mind straight away, you're in a kind of butcher shop, you know. It's about knives. Everything's chopped up. It enables you to plan and to implement strategies and to be logical and think in terms of steps. And inevitably the basic assumption is I, and the other. Basic unreality is I and the other. But from the mind's point of view, or from the point of view of the ego processes, I mean, it makes utter sense. So this separation that's inherent in the thought I, that is then projected into the world, and when then we see the world as us and them, is the basic delusion, and it's what much of spiritual methodology is all about defeating, for the simple reason is there really isn't anything else to do. What remains when that's gone is the fulfillment of devotion. So You know, there it is in a nutshell. But the soul will be present without the ego. It doesn't work the other way around.
Okay. Just flipping a little ahead in the manuscript, and this was something I can remember hearing it for the first time in a lecture, and I sat up straight. And it talks at this point about people trying to influence others' spiritual path vis-a-vis the teachings that they adhere to. And again, I'm just going to recite just a paragraph from the manuscript. Recently, I've had 3 discussions with people who wanted to convert me into adopting their fetish. Their fetish being the form of spiritual teaching they were following. One urged me to read A Course in Miracles, another referred me to Osho, and a third reminded me that Rumi was, is, and always will be, and that I could connect with him like all spiritual masters if I just knew how. These are all fetishes. I, and I hope you, wouldn't dream of telling people what to do unless they asked. Even then, we should approach the task with reserve and caution. Unless someone approaches you, you have no right to presume we can take their autonomy, their ability to make and learn from their mistakes, away from them. Spirituality is not some game of trying to find the right way and then applying it indiscriminately to everyone. And in that part of the manuscript, you began by saying, recently I had 3 discussions with people who wanted to convert me. How did you deal with those situations of people wanting, let me put it another way, inviting you to share in a spiritual practice or teaching that they felt spoke to their heart, but on some level you didn't feel spoke to yours?
One tries to be gracious, you know. One tries to be kind. You know, you try to be fair about it all. I mean, very often these days in social media, I think, I'm surely not the only one, we've learned through the masses of emails and social media that we have to not answer everything because life is too short. You know, we just don't have enough time. So I think after a while certain things go in they don't get into the in tray, you know. So sometimes I don't answer. Sometimes I would just say thanks in one form or another and try to be gracious. Having said that, I fell foul even this week. Somebody threw a couple of remarks at me and then considered that I do well to read Rudolf Steiner and Osho. Osho comes up again and again. And I fell. I didn't follow my rules here. And I also didn't do my 2-3 day rule, by the way, which is don't answer anything unless you have a couple of nights sleep before you do. Right. And I just tore off something about, you know, because my kids used to go to Steiner school, there were Steiner groups there, many people didn't understand Steiner, and Steiner's spiritual teaching has always been transparent to me. I don't say that out of big-headedness, I find in Steiner a kindred spirit, I mean an extraordinary spirit, a great teacher, and a strange teacher and a strange man in many ways, and almost unbelievable in the breadth of his understanding and vision, and specializing in looking and turning over his spiritual teaching. I found a lot of people found it extraordinarily obfuscating, and so I'd go in and say, look, it actually means this. And I do what I am sometimes good at, or what I aspire to, which is talking of profound truths in ways that make sense to people who are not academic or scholarly, or don't use, you know, words of more than 2-3 syllables the most. And yeah, I can do that, and I can do it with Steiner. So I just wrote back and said, look, I've expounded Steiner, I've interpreted Steiner to people, and I met Osho, you know, I mean, I was there, and, you know, and I got a nice reply. It was like, oh, you know, great, that must have been wonderful, and that's the end of that. So I broke the rules. The important point about all of this that I'd like to make, I can't remember now if it's in the lecture, is that, you know, once you have traversed the road and you've reached a destination, you don't need the road. And it's one of the difficulties I have, and some of us may have, with religions and, you know, doctrinal institutions, which is this fetishizing of the book, not to mention the teachings. I mean, if the book and the teachings and the teacher and what he or she has to say and all of this are any use at all, hopefully it won't be to go around stroking the book or, you know, practicing with iconography and all this kind of stuff. When you've made it, you can drop it. You're not going to need that material anymore. And so what I have tried to say here and there is, you know, spiritual teaching has a very definite practical function, and it's to get you there. And if you look through my window or somebody else's window, and if it's not getting you there, you're in the wrong place. You know, the litmus gauge for this is, are you following your heart? And then trust it all the way, you know, and let it take you there. But don't get caught up in it as a thing, and I don't think Osho would be interested in that remotely. In fact, I know he wouldn't, and I don't think Jesus would be interested in it either. I think Jesus would be very disappointed with Christianity, for example. I think Buddha would be very disappointed with Buddhism. You know, you look at it that way, it's like, what has all this been about when we get immersed in religions and methods and you know, the written word and so on? It's a means.
It was, I was gifted with a very unique poster. A couple of summers ago, I was walking the dog one afternoon, and this poster caught my eye. It was promoting a new style of schooling or teaching for small children, but the title on the poster shared, "Learning is natural, school is optional." And I thought it was, and I think applicable in what you just shared, is that it's quite natural to grow spiritually, to, you know, return to oneself. The methods that we use, we have to remember, are only that, and we don't have to necessarily follow anything institutionalized. We don't necessarily have to follow doctrine. We can follow our heart and whatever speaks to us. Whether that is something institutionalized, great, wonderful. If it speaks to you, you know, go with it. If it doesn't, find something that does. There's an interesting passage later on in the lecture. It's getting towards the end. And this is a bit of a philosophical question I have for you, but first I'm going to read these two paragraphs. It's entitled, this section is entitled, "Everything is Consciousness." And you share that there is no difference between you and I. We are the same as a tree, a mountain, a flower, or an animal. We are human beings, but we are much more than that. Even the term human tells us that we are made of homogeneous material. We are the same composition, the same cake, so to speak, of material, physical, mental, intellectual, rational, emotional, energetic, spiritual, soulful transcendence, earthbound, and divine. However, there is one difference between you and a rock, you and a wave in the ocean, you and a tree. You are capable of self-reflection through the practice of awareness, and by means of awareness, you may realize the self. This means that you may attain to the truth of your real self, your real nature. And in reading back over the manuscripts, I believe I understand what you're trying to get across. But the question I have, and again, perhaps philosophical, is how do we actually know that a rock, a wave in the ocean, a tree, is not capable of self-reflection through the practice of awareness? And it may sound like a really silly question, but how do we know that? I mean, I walk out into my backyard and there's this most amazing tree. It's what's very popular in Canada here, a maple tree. And we have the gift of it turning color. The leaves turn color, beautiful golden red in the fall when it drops, and in the spring the leaves come back. And it's got this immense canopy of leaves that gift us with shade during the summer. And so often I walk out and I look at this huge trunk and I follow it up to this absolutely massive canopy that stands some 50, 60 feet above the ground. It's immense. And I look at it and I'm just in awe at this thing. And there's this energy every time I go out. I feel like saying hello, and I feel like it's leaves are all just rustling and they're going hello back. But how do we know that, even this rock that I'm holding here, how do we know it doesn't have a consciousness to the point where it's capable of self-reflection? How do we know that?
Well, trees are clearly amazing beings, so maybe having self-reflection and then the ability to use that to self-realize ourselves, maybe then we come back as a tree or a rock or a crystal or something. It's not a hierarchy here. It's an idea that's been around for a long time. I'd like to answer it. Firstly, there's a funny answer. How many, enlightened master rocks have you met recently? And this kind of thing. But the overall idea of a hierarchy from the mineral realm on through, vegetables and through animals and so on, was challenged by Ramana Maharshi. And, he asserted that certain animals are capable of enlightenment, and since he's one of my teachers, that's fine with me, and I got an enlightened dog here now, so it's that's fine, and there's these wonderful pictures of him with the monkeys. But perhaps what we could say is, quite regardless of whether that is saying that humans, rather than being caretakers of the planet, are in some ways superior to trees, rather to say that this is something that distinguishes us as far as we know, for the simple reason that there is an amazing consciousness. I've seen it out here, I'm sure you've seen it with animals, to let go what we would see as disasters and descend into depression about, and hardly want to wake up. And animals, of course, they just go on. We've had animals here die, and their peer groups just go on playing and having a great time. And they're clearly capable of feeling in dog or cat consciousness. And we've had animals. We had to take a leg off an animal here, who then just carried on running and scuttling about, just, as if it had four legs and as if it sort of didn't matter. This ability to self-reflect's not all good news, right? It's not all fun. But I'll think about that one.
I like your comment about this ability to self-reflect may not always be good news. I think it's a gift, but I think it's just like with any gift. How one uses it informs us what kind of gift it is. You end the lecture with the following statement, which just really speaks to my heart. Here at the coming time of this winter solstice, at the time the lecture was given, it was around the winter solstice, I would like to dedicate our discussions about the gate to a theme that draws Christians, pagan, in ancient religions, East and West, North and South, together into one all-consuming tremendous message, the ecumenical communication, the message that was ignored, though delivered so brightly by Swami Vivekananda 100 years ago in the Parliament of Religions in Chicago. That theme is the practice of devotion to a God-man, a divine human who could offer salvation to humankind and to the world, a child, a human born from a mortal woman who realized his or her divine nature and manifests truth. And to this powerful truth, I would like to add that that child is in you and me. What right do we have to withhold our divinity from existence? And the question, as I reflected on this when I looked back over the manuscript, was how could or can, because I witness it currently, go so wrong in creating faith traditions as a means to exclusivity and separation from each other. I'm so blessed and fortunate to be a visiting chaplain at a local university. And one of the gifts and opportunity that have been provided this coming academic year is to offer on a regular basis interfaith meditation and dialogue. And I'm using the golden rule, if you or the listeners are familiar with that, but it's the 13 faith traditions take on the Christian paradigm of do unto others as you would want done unto you, but shares in their own faith tradition and the beautiful similarity and commonality among that very moral foundation of do unto others as you would want done unto you. But how could humanity go so wrong in creating these different faith traditions that that seem to spawn exclusivity or separation, as opposed to unity?
Yeah. It was a small, localized world for so long, isn't it? It's hard for us to remember, or maybe you and I, because we're a little older, but people who are 20s or in their 30s, it's hard to cast back and remember that there wasn't a global community of interest and awareness of the world, you know, and how big it is, and not to mention other planets and everything else. And I think that, I guess what I want to say about it is the cultural inflection that is inherent in the creation of a religion adheres it to its geographical context. And that's nowhere as obvious and clear perhaps than in Tibetan Buddhism, you know, which the further you go into it, the more foreign it becomes to anybody but presumably a Tibetan Buddhist, and the more very strange it becomes, and the more unlike our Western culture for sure it becomes, you know, which is one of the reasons the Dalai Lama has said he's reluctant to teach in the West, which is a fabulous remark, I think. But I think when we look back to the thousands of years of the creation of world religions and more localized religions, and realize that it was in relationship to a localized consciousness, certainly not a global consciousness or even a consciousness of a continent, that we can see something that we're going to in the future that's really important. And the really important thing in the future is what happens to religion and spirituality in a global consciousness when localization and the context of the culture of the place in which you live is now probably not even so well defined, because the Western value system and Western activities is beginning to take over the globe. A lot of the East is West now. We can't even talk about East and West geographically anymore with anything that makes sense. So a really interesting question is, in a global community or in billions of people beginning to understand the world and have a sensibility of empathy and compassion with other people on the other side of the world in very different circumstances, what happens to localized religion? What happens to religion that was based in a certain place, whether it's hundreds or thousands of years old, in relationship to a whole different way of looking at it? And I hope that what will happen is what Vivekananda started 100 years ago. It is and failed in, so to speak, but he planted a seed, because it's a very beautiful, it's a very wonderful story, and I encourage anybody to look at it for the synchronicity involved in it, and the intentionality and the divine intervention, really, because he wasn't even invited, to this incredible Congress. But when you look at the holy wars and you look at the body count of the last 100 years, you can't help but think about what might have happened if Christianity hadn't prevailed at the Parliament of Religions in Chicago in 19-something, I always forget the date. But if Christianity had yielded and let go of its, well, Christianity, the Christian leaders who were in the Parliament, had yielded and let go of their agenda, which was Christianity and the lesser religions, and we're going to establish this kind of two-part hierarchy, and listened to Vivekananda, which, by the way, he was listened to, but then, of course, the idea was rejected, and his idea was Ramakrishna's idea, and it was that all religions are basically the same. They are all our personal inflection of our search for God. And therefore we have that in common, and let's rest in that, and let's practice toleration, cooperation and peace. And what you notice is we've done anything but that in the last 100 years, not to mention hundreds of years before. So, a bow to Vivekananda, I think.
And let's use that to bring this interview to a close. We can look forward, when we come together again, to beginning a discussion of sacred attention, awakening, liberation, and spirituality in the world. Again, another two-part lecture. And this one interesting because I think it also brings into and discusses, I've talked to you about this before, a little bit of a focus on the practitioner, in addition to the seeker. But there's some material in these two lectures on sacred attention that very much will speak to practitioners and to counselors and therapists. So I look forward to beginning that with you. Thank you.
Look forward to it too. Thank you, Robert. And thank you to everyone who's been listening.
Indeed. Bye-bye.
Till next time.
Bye-bye.